The room had everything money could build and power could command: crystal chandeliers, marble floors, men whose names moved markets and ended careers without ever being spoken aloud. And at the center of it all, Im Ho-Jun, immaculate in white, untouchable in every way that mattered. Until he wasn't. He went down without a sound. No warning, no last word. One moment the most feared man in Seoul held the room in his fist, and the next he was on the floor, still and silent, his empire carrying on without him. What happened next would reveal something no amount of wealth or influence could manufacture. His girlfriend Yoon Min stood in that doorway, elegant, calculated, and within 4 seconds, gone. She chose the story she could control over the man she claimed to love. The guards froze, the guests disappeared, the inner circle, every last person paid to be loyal, found somewhere else to be. And then there was Lacie. A maid, black and white uniform, silver tray set down without ceremony. She crossed that marble floor alone and dropped to her knees beside him, calm, precise, completely without hesitation. The woman no one ever looked at was the only one who stayed. Before we continue this thrilling story, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. Where are you watching from? Like, comment and share. To understand what happened that night, you have to first understand the world Im Ho-Jun had built, and what it cost to maintain it. He did not inherit his power. He constructed it piece by piece over 15 years of calculated decisions and cold silences, until his name alone was enough to end negotiations before they began. In Seoul's underworld, there were men with armies, men with money, men with influence that stretched across borders. Ho-Jun had all three, but what truly separated him was something harder to quantify: a stillness. A quality of absolute control that made everyone around him feel slightly off balance, as though the floor beneath their feet belonged to him, and he was simply allowing them to stand on it. His estate reflected this. It was not loud. It did not announce itself. It simply existed at a level that made everything else look like it was trying too hard. Wide corridors of polished stone, rooms that absorbed sound rather than echoed it, staff who moved through the space like water around rock, present but never felt. The dinner party that evening was not a social event. It never was. Every gathering Ho-Jun hosted was architecture, each guest placed with purpose, each conversation a transaction dressed in courtesy. Senators sat beside men whose businesses they would never publicly acknowledge. Trade figures were confirmed over wine and never written down. The table was a courtroom, and Ho-Jun sat at its head not as a host but as the verdict. Yoon Min sat at his right. She had been with him for 2 years, long enough to understand the performance required and skilled enough to deliver it without appearing to try. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, precise, deliberate, designed to be noticed. She laughed at the right moments, touched his arm with perfect timing, wore the red dress that photographed well and said nothing that could be held against her. She was exactly what Ho-Jun had selected her to be, the ideal surface, and for a long time he had mistaken surface for substance. No one at that table paid any attention to the woman refilling the water glasses at the far end of the room. Lacie had been employed at the estate for 6 months. She arrived on time, completed every task without complaint, and disappeared into the background with the kind of consistency that made her effectively invisible. The senior staff called her reliable. Ho-Jun had never called her anything. He had never spoken to her directly, not once. She existed in the margins of his world the way furniture exists, present, functional, unnoticed. What no one in that room understood was that invisible is not the same as absent. Lacie watched everything. She had been watching since the day she arrived. She noted the patterns of the household, the movements of certain guests, the names that surfaced repeatedly in conversations that were never meant to carry across a room. She was quiet. She was careful. She was there for a reason that had nothing to do with polished silverware or pressed linens. That night, as the last course was being cleared, and the room hummed with the low current of power doing what power does, she was still watching. And then everything changed. It started with a glass. Ho-Jun reached for his water, a gesture so routine, so unremarkable, that no one registered it as the last normal moment of the evening. His hand stopped halfway. His body followed. Not violently, not dramatically, just a slow, total surrender to gravity, as though every system that kept him upright had quietly agreed to stop at once. The glass struck the edge of the table on the way down. The sound was sharp and clean and final. For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. The room did not erupt. That is the detail most people would get wrong if they told this story later. There was no screaming, no rush of bodies toward the fallen man. There was instead a specific, terrible silence, the silence of people making calculations. Powerful people, trained by instinct and survival to assess a situation before attaching themselves to it. What they saw was the most dangerous man in the room lying motionless on his own floor. And what they felt, though none of them would ever admit it, was an acute awareness of what association with a vulnerable Ho-Jun might cost them. The guests found reasons to move toward the exits, not running, walking with the deliberate calm of people pretending they had somewhere else to be, conversations that dissolved mid-sentence, chairs pushed back with quiet precision. Within 90 seconds, a room that had held 40 people was nearly empty. Yoon Min stood at the edge of the table and looked at him for a long moment. Her face did not collapse. It arranged itself, brow slightly furrowed, lips pressed together, the careful expression of a woman managing optics in real time. She took one step toward him, then stopped. Her eyes moved to the door, to the guests still filtering out, to the security cameras positioned at the corners of the ceiling. Then she reached into her clutch, retrieved her phone and walked toward the exit. Not running, never running. Her red dress caught the light one last time as she passed through the doorway and was gone. No one called for help, no one knelt down, no one touched him. Except Lacie. She had set down the water pitcher before most people had even registered the sound of the glass. She moved across the room without announcing herself, without hesitation, without waiting for permission she was never going to receive. She reached him in the space others had left behind and dropped to her knees on that cold marble floor like it was the most natural thing in the world. 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse present, irregular, weak. She tilted his head back slightly, checked his airway, pressed the back of her hand near his mouth and felt the shallow warmth of his breath. Her face was composed. Her hands were steady. Every movement was deliberate, not the frantic motion of panic, but the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before in harder circumstances with higher stakes. She was still working when the security team finally came through the door. They stopped when they saw her. 4 armed men, trained to neutralize any threat in this building, and they simply stopped, because the scene in front of them did not match any protocol they had prepared for. The maid was already in command, and Ho-Jun was still breathing. Ho-Jun woke up to a ceiling he recognized, and a silence he didn't. The room was his, the high windows, the grey light of early morning pressing through the curtains, the particular quiet of a space built to keep the world out. But something in the atmosphere had shifted, the way a room feels different after something significant has happened inside it, even once it's been tidied and reset. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory of himself. The weakness was unfamiliar. The disorientation worse. Im Ho-Jun had not felt physically powerless since he was 17 years old, and the sensation arrived now with the same quiet violence it had then, a reminder that the body does not negotiate, does not defer to reputation, does not care what a man has built. His chief of security delivered the briefing within minutes of his waking. The guests had dispersed. The evening had been contained. No outside reports, no photographs. The story, such as it was, had not left the walls of the estate. Ho-Jun listened. Then he asked 2 questions. The first was about the cause of the collapse. His physician had been contacted. Tests were pending, answers were coming. The second question was about Yoon Min. The silence that followed it was its own answer. His security chief was a man who had delivered difficult information across 15 years without visible discomfort. He was visibly uncomfortable now. Yoon Min had left the premises shortly after the incident. She had not called. She had not returned. Ho-Jun said nothing. He turned his gaze toward the window and let the information settle where it needed to settle. Then his security chief mentioned one more thing. The maid, Lacie, had remained with him until the medical team arrived. She had provided a clear account of his condition, his positioning, and what she had done. She had then returned to her duties. He asked to see her. She came without hurry. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people who entered this room moved with a specific energy, a heightened awareness of where they were and who they were standing in front of. Lacie walked in the way she apparently did everything, at her own pace without performance. She stood at a respectful distance and waited. He studied her for a moment before speaking. Then he thanked her, simply, directly, without the elaborate phrasing he might use in other contexts, and he asked her what she had seen when she reached him. She told him, clearly clinically without editorializing, pulse rate, breathing, probable cause based on observable symptoms. She described her actions in sequence and explained the reasoning behind each one. He asked her where she had learned that. She paused, brief, almost imperceptible. Then she said she had received medical training before coming to Seoul. She did not elaborate. She did not invite the follow-up question. He let it rest, for now. What stayed with him after she left the room was not gratitude, though that was present. It was something harder to name. In 15 years of building an empire, of surrounding himself with people who spoke carefully and moved strategically, not one of them had ever spoken to him the way she just had. Like he was simply a person, nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't sure in that moment whether that felt like relief or like the beginning of something he wasn't prepared for. Ho-Jun did not confront Yoon Min. That was never his way. Confrontation implied that the other person held enough standing to warrant a response, and by the morning after the dinner party, Yoon Min had forfeited whatever standing she possessed. He made 2 phone calls, the first to his attorney, the second to the building management of the apartment he had been financing in her name. By midday, the arrangements that had quietly structured her life for 2 years were quietly being undone. There was no argument, no final conversation, no moment where she stood across from him and was given the opportunity to explain herself. She had already explained herself. In the 4 seconds she stood in that doorway and chose the exit. Words after that would have been beside the point. Yoon Min understood what the silence meant when his calls stopped coming. She waited 2 days before she acted, and when she did, she acted in the only arena where she held any real leverage, visibility. A carefully placed comment to a journalist she had cultivated over years. A social media post, artfully ambiguous, designed to generate sympathy without exposing specifics. An appearance at a public event where photographers would capture exactly the image she wanted to project, composed, unbothered, moving on. She understood how narrative worked. She had watched Ho-Jun shape reality through controlled information for 2 years. She believed she had learned enough. She had not. His reach was longer than her network, his resources deeper than her connections, and his indifference to her campaign more devastating than any direct retaliation could have been. The story she was trying to build found no traction. The journalists she contacted discovered reasons not to pursue it. The sympathy she was reaching for never materialized. Within a week, the silence from his direction was total, and in that world, total silence from Im Ho-Jun was its own kind of verdict. Inside the estate, the shift was felt before it was understood. Household staff operate on patterns. They are attuned, by necessity, to the rhythms of the people they work for, the moods, the preferences, the subtle changes in atmosphere that signal something has moved. The senior housekeeper noticed first that Yoon Min's name had stopped appearing on the weekly schedule of expected visitors. Then she noticed that Mr. Im had twice redirected household questions to Lacie, small things, logistical things, the kind of quiet delegation that meant nothing individually and everything collectively. The other staff began to notice too, not that anything dramatic had happened. Nothing dramatic ever happened in this house. It was the quality of attention that registered, the fact that when Lacie entered a room Ho-Jun occupied, something in the air changed slightly, that he had asked for her specific opinion on a household matter rather than issuing a directive, that she had given it without hesitation, and he had acted on it without comment. No one said anything aloud. In a house like this, you did not narrate what you observed. But everyone understood, in the way that people understand things before they are confirmed, that the woman who had been invisible 6 months ago was invisible no longer. Something had shifted, and whatever it was, it had not finished shifting yet. It began with a reassignment. Ho-Jun framed it as a practical decision, and in the way he constructed it, it was nearly convincing. The estate required someone with stronger organizational oversight of the private quarters. The role demanded discretion, reliability, and an ability to operate without supervision. He had observed these qualities in Lacie directly. The reassignment was logical. That was the version presented to the household. Lacie accepted it without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of answer. She moved into the new responsibilities with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, managing the private schedule, overseeing the medical provisions that had been increased since his collapse, coordinating the flow of information between departments that required his direct attention. She was closer now. structurally, unavoidably closer, and she understood exactly why. The testing began in small ways, a question asked twice days apart, worded differently, checking whether her answers remained consistent, a piece of information offered to her, and then referenced later in a context where its disclosure would have been revealing, a task assigned that required her to access areas of the estate she had not previously entered, followed by a quiet audit of what she had touched, opened, read. Lacie moved through each test without breaking her stride. She answered consistently because she was in the areas being tested, telling the truth. She accessed what she needed and nothing she didn't, at least, nothing that could be traced. She understood she was being measured, and she gave him accurate readings in all the places she could afford to. What she could not afford was his attention intensifying the way it was. He began to appear in spaces where their paths would naturally cross, the corridor near the medical wing in the early evening, the kitchen at an hour when the senior staff had retired. He did not manufacture conversation. He simply occupied the same space and allowed proximity to do its work. He asked her questions that had nothing to do with her duties, where she had grown up, what she had studied, what had brought her to Seoul specifically. She answered carefully, partially, enough to seem open, not enough to be exposed. One evening, she was organizing the medication schedule in the side room adjacent to his study when he appeared in the doorway and told her that the East Wing guest quarters had been prepared for her. The commute from staff housing, he said, created unnecessary delays. She would be more accessible here. Lacie set down the folder she was holding. She looked at him directly, not with hostility, but with the particular clarity of someone who has decided that precision matters more than diplomacy. "You're not protecting me," she said. "You're containing me, there's a difference." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the recognition that passed between two people who are equally intelligent and have just confirmed it about each other. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a fractional adjustment, the look of a man recalibrating. "Perhaps," he said finally, "does it matter?" "It does to me," she replied, and she picked up the folder and returned to her work. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. Then he left, but they both knew the conversation was far from finished. She found it on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after the reassignment, in a file she had every legitimate reason to access. The medical records from the evening of the collapse had been compiled by Ho-Jun's private physician and stored in the estate's health management system, a system Lacie now oversaw as part of her expanded responsibilities. She had been reviewing the documentation methodically, cross-referencing medication logs with the timeline of symptoms, because something about the physician's report had been sitting at the edge of her attention like a word she couldn't quite remember. She found it in the toxicology notes, or rather she found what wasn't there. The report attributed the collapse to severe stress-induced cardiac disruption. It was a plausible conclusion. It was also, to someone with her training, incomplete in specific ways that were too consistent to be accidental. Certain markers were absent from the documented blood work, markers that should have been ordered given the symptom presentation, markers whose absence told its own story. Someone had either missed them through incompetence or omitted them through intention. Lacie did not believe in coincidence at this level. She spent the next 4 days moving carefully. She cross-referenced pharmaceutical delivery records against the household inventory logs. She traced the preparation records for that evening's dinner service. And then, buried in a procurement file attached to a catering account she almost didn't open, she found the thread. The name attached to it stopped her completely. She sat with it for a long moment, the screen casting pale light across her face in the quiet of the late-night office. The name was one she recognized, not from this household, from before, from a different city, a different life, a medical licensing board hearing that had dismantled her career with evidence she had always known was fabricated, and a key witness whose testimony had sealed the outcome. The same man sat inside Ho-Jun's trusted circle. The architecture of it was almost elegant, in the way that terrible things sometimes are. She had come to Seoul to find proof of what had been done to her. She had taken this position because proximity to this organization gave her access she couldn't obtain any other way. She had been patient, careful, and methodical for 6 months. And now the evidence she needed to protect Ho-Jun and the evidence that could restore her own life were attached to the same name. Using one meant exposing the other. Revealing what she knew about the poisoning required explaining how she had known where to look, and why. It meant disclosing the investigation she had been running quietly inside his household since the day she arrived. It meant handing Ho-Jun every reason to conclude that she was exactly what his instincts had been trained to identify, someone with a hidden agenda, operating under false pretenses inside his walls. She closed the file, opened it again, closed it. The man who had destroyed her career was trying to kill the man who had become, despite every intention she had entered this house with, something she could not reduce to a target anymore. Lacie had come here with a mission. She had not come here to care about the outcome for anyone but herself. That had changed, and she needed to decide quickly and carefully what she was going to do about it. She knew before he summoned her that something had changed. It was not anything she could point to directly, no visible shift in the household routine, no unusual movement of staff. It was subtler than that, a quality of stillness in the estate that was different from its usual quiet, the particular way his assistant delivered the request for her presence without meeting her eyes. Lacie set down what she was doing, smoothed the front of her uniform and walked to his study. He was standing when she entered, which was unusual. He was typically seated in these encounters, a deliberate positioning that placed her at a slight disadvantage. Standing meant something else. It meant he had not yet decided how to hold what he was carrying. He waited until she had closed the door before he spoke. He told her without preface that his investigators had completed a background review. He told her they had found the medical license, the university records, the licensing board hearing, the testimony that had turned against her, the suspension that followed. He told her they had traced her movements from her home country to Seoul, the timeline of her employment search, and the specific sequence of events that had led her to his door. He placed a single photograph on the desk between them, a man's face, someone she recognized, someone currently embedded in his organization's financial infrastructure. Then he looked at her and waited. Lacie understood that this was not a conversation she could navigate partially. The room did not have space for half-truths anymore. He had already mapped the territory. He was simply waiting to see whether she would walk it honestly or attempt to manage it. And she was tired of the careful calibration, tired of the weight of carrying two separate purposes through the same narrow space every day. She told him everything. She told him about the licensing board hearing, the fabricated evidence, the witness whose testimony had been purchased. She told him she had identified the connection to his organization 8 months before applying for the position. She told him she had come with the intention of finding documentation that could restore what had been taken from her. She told him she had never planned to harm him or his operation, that her purpose had always been singular and personal, that she had found what she came for, and then found something else entirely that she had not anticipated. He listened without interrupting. His face remained composed throughout. When she finished, the room held the specific silence of a space where something irreversible has just been said. Then he looked down at the photograph on the desk and back at her. "You found the connection to the poisoning," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "And you chose to sit with that information rather than use it as leverage." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a recalibration deeper than the ones she had observed before, because he was now holding two truths simultaneously, that she had entered his house under false pretenses, and that she was the only person in it who had ever demonstrated a loyalty that cost her something real. "You came here for your own war," he said finally. "I did," she replied. "And yet you stayed for mine." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The answer was already standing in the room with both of them. Ho-Jun moved the way he always moved when something needed to be resolved, quietly, completely, and without announcing his intentions until they were already in motion. Within 48 hours of Lacie's confession, his investigators had pulled every financial thread attached to the man in the photograph. The procurement records Lacie had traced were the beginning. His team followed them to 3 additional accounts, 2 offshore transfers, and a series of communications that documented not just the poisoning, but a longer pattern of calculated positioning. A man who had spent 18 months building a case for removing Ho-Jun and stepping into the vacuum his absence would create. It was, by any measure, a sophisticated operation. It had simply been constructed by someone who underestimated how thoroughly Ho-Jun documented his own world. The removal was handled without spectacle. There was no confrontation in a grand room, no assembled audience. The man was met privately, presented with the documentation in full, and given the precise dimensions of his situation. What happened after that was swift and irreversible, and the details belonged to a part of Ho-Jun's world that operated beyond the reach of any record. What mattered was that it was finished. The estate exhaled in the days that followed, though no one could have explained exactly why. The quality of tension that had been embedded in the household's atmosphere, present for longer than anyone had consciously registered, was simply gone. Meetings ran cleaner. The staff moved with less careful awareness, something that had been coiled slowly released. Lacie felt it too, but she was navigating something else alongside the relief. On the 4th day after the removal, Ho-Jun's attorney contacted her directly. She was presented with a package of documentation that she did not immediately understand, correspondence between legal teams in 2 countries, a formal petition to the Medical Licensing Board, and a series of affidavits from witnesses whose testimony contradicted the account that had been used against her at her hearing. She sat with the documents for a long time before she fully absorbed what they represented. Ho-Jun had not simply addressed the threat inside his organization. He had followed the evidence backwards through her history and assembled everything needed to challenge the verdict that had dismantled her career. The falsified testimony, the financial exchange behind it, the institutional pressure that had ensured the outcome. It was all there, documented, sourced, and formally submitted. She had come to Seoul to find this. She had spent months moving carefully through the edges of a dangerous world, carrying her purpose quietly, protecting it from exposure. And in the end, it had been resolved not through her careful maneuvering, but through the decisive action of the man she had come here to investigate. That irony was not lost on her. She sat with it honestly, the way she had learned to sit with difficult things without rushing past it, without softening its edges. Both debts had been settled, the threat to his life removed, the theft of her life addressed. There was nothing left that either of them owed the other in the transactional sense, no obligation, no leverage, no remaining imbalance to negotiate around. For the first time since she had walked through the doors of this estate, Lacie had no hidden purpose, no quiet mission running beneath the surface of her days. She was simply here, and so was he. The open ground between them was unfamiliar, but it was honest, and for 2 people who had been navigating the weight of concealment for as long as either of them could clearly remember, honesty felt like the most significant thing in the room. He found her in the East Wing library on a quiet evening, 7 days after the documents had been delivered. She was seated at the long table near the window, the legal correspondence spread before her, a pen in her hand that she hadn't been using. He sat down across from her without being invited. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression was composed but open, the particular openness of someone who has decided that composure and honesty can occupy the same space. Ho-Jun did not reach for careful language. He had spent 15 years constructing sentences designed to control outcomes, and he was tired of the architecture. He told her that he had reviewed her licensing board submission, that his attorneys believed the reinstatement timeline was favorable, that there was nothing administratively remaining that his office had not already addressed. She told him she knew, she thanked him, simply, directly. Then neither of them spoke for a moment. He broke the silence first. He told her that what he was about to say existed outside the boundaries of employment, obligation, or debt, that he was not offering her a position or a contract or a version of the arrangement they had been operating within since the night he collapsed on his own floor. He wanted her to understand that the slate was clear, that she owed him nothing, and he was not calling in a favor. Then he told her the truth, that she was the only person who had ever stood in his world without performing for it, that she had entered with her own purpose and still chose his life over her leverage when the moment required it. That in 38 years, through every alliance and negotiation and carefully constructed relationship, no one had ever made him feel seen in the specific way she did, not as a threat to be managed or a resource to be cultivated, but as a person whose survival genuinely mattered to someone else. He told her he did not know what to do with that, but he knew he was unwilling to let it leave the room without naming it honestly. Lacie listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she set down the pen she had not been using and looked at him steadily. She told him she was returning to medicine. That was not a negotiation. She told him she would not live inside the boundaries of his world, not as an employee, not as a protected person, not in any configuration that required her to disappear back into the margins. She had spent too long being invisible. She was not willing to return to it, regardless of how gilded the arrangement. He told her he understood. He told her he would not ask her to. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she had learned to read him, past the surface and into the place where he was simply a man without his armor. Then she said quietly that understanding was a reasonable place to begin. What they built after that was not a fairy tale. It was something harder and more durable, two people who had seen each other without flattery or fear and chosen presence anyway. Power, it turns out, does not prove itself when everything is working. It proves itself in the moment it fails. Im Ho-Jun had fallen on a cold marble floor in a room full of powerful people, and every single one of them had found somewhere else to be. Except the woman who had the most complicated reasons to leave. She had stayed, not out of duty, not out of strategy, out of the one thing that cannot be purchased, commanded, or manufactured. And that was the only thing that had ever truly changed him. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below. Would you have stayed or walked out that door? Be honest. If you're new here and this hit different, subscribe, because every story we tell goes deeper than the last. And like this video if you think Lacie made the right call. I want to see where the vote lands.